Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for helping my project. Could you say a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I'm Peter Crew, and I've been a space buff for years and years and years. I'm retired airline and uh, work as a act as a volunteer at Space Center Houston, here in Houston, obviously, and am have done things for the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation, and also during the shuttle uh, history. Uh, the National Space Society had a program called Dial a Shuttle that was available for people to dial in on a dedicated number from AT&T, and they would get they'd be able to listen to live conversation air to ground from the astronauts when they were awake, and also pre-recorded programs that we would do interviewing different people around the space center um, when they were asleep. So I've quite an interest in the space program.
That sounds really neat. I wish I had known about that.
Yeah, we the first flight that we did it for was STS-7. That was Sally Ride's flight. That was when the team got together and met for the first time. And for those of us who didn't necessarily work in the space industry directly, it sure was fun to have that press pass for JSC that allowed us access at any hour and basically back in the 80s, go wherever we wanted.
That is really amazing. And you mentioned that you're in aviation. Can you talk about what you did in aviation?
Yes, I worked for United Airlines, the original version of United Airlines, and spent 25 years in customer service and in operations doing load plan and weight and balance. And we were a line station at the time. So those of us who were there pitched in and did everything: loading airplanes, weight and balance, getting flight plans together, um, everything.
Um, and which did you have an interest in first, aviation or space?
Good question. Aviation first. Although I'm old enough to remember Alan Shepard's first flight, uh, being in, gosh, I don't know, would have been, well, obviously elementary school, but we had a program that day. And at the time of the launch, I remember vividly the school administration, the principal rolling an old black and white TV out onto the stage and plugging it in so that we could all do the countdown and watch Alan Shepard head for space. So uh, just a long time interest.
Did you ever think maybe you would be a pilot or an astronaut?
I would have I would have liked to have been a pilot. Uh, my eyesight, I was an Air Force ROTC in college, and it was during the Vietnam era, so that was an interesting time. But my eyesight wasn't quite good enough to qualify for pilot training. So I got out of the Air Force ROTC program.
So if you were in elementary school during Alan Shepard's trip, you must have been in high school whenever Neil and Buzz landed on the moon.
Yep, I was graduating from high school at that point in time, and it would have been the beginning of my first year of college. And remember the launch and following every minute of that, and the course of the flight, the different broadcasts from the crew, and the landing. Of course, that was unforgettable. My parents and I gathered in our family's house den and watched Walter Cronkite doing his thing on CBS, and also had the good fortune to have a brother who worked with Wally Schirra when Wally left NASA and went to a company out in Colorado. And so I had the opportunity of meeting Wally and becoming a member of the Turtle Club.
What is the Turtle Club?
The Turtle Club was a club that I believe started with test pilots back in the 50s and 60s and was then adopted by the astronauts. And there were a number of questions that were asked. And if the proper response wasn't given, the person who was a member of the club who didn't give the proper response would have to buy a round of drinks, a round of beers for everyone at the first opportunity.
I think I remember reading something about that in the book Dragonfly, talking about the shuttle mirror program.
Yep, and that was a payback to Deke Slayton from Wally. Well, actually, it didn't come directly from Wally, but during Wally Schirra's flight, his 6-orbit flight, after Scott Carpenter and the Mercury program, Deke Slayton got him on the air and said something to the effect of, "Wally, are you a turtle today?" And Wally gave the proper response, and I don't know if I can give that response.
um, and you know, about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, there was an astronaut training class that called themselves the Turtles.
Mhm.
Do you think that has any relationship to the Turtles from back then?
I don't know. I imagine that is continued on to a certain extent to this day. Probably so. Probably so.
So what's your very first, kind of space memory? Was it uh, Alan Shepard, or did the Sputnik make an impact on you? Or
I would have been 7 at the time of Sputnik, and it kind of made an impact on me because a friend of mine and I were very much into the wonderfully done science fiction movies of the 50s, Earth versus the Flying Saucers being an example, the Giant Claw being another one. Anyway, the movies that now look really, really, really hokey. And I kind of remember the headlines that day. I lived in Dayton, Ohio at the time, and so right pat, the Air Force Base was very close. And there were a lot of pilot types, a lot of aviation people who, enough so that the papers really headlined the event at the time. Yes.
and I guess going back to Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landing on the moon, what kind of impression that make on you?
I was looking forward to us to expand from the moon and to follow the plan that was put together by Agnew's Space Task Group, I think, to press on to establish a base and then on to ours in the 80s and 90s. But obviously didn't happen. And hopefully Artemis can begin that tradition again or that exploration again. But we have to get it off the launch pad first.
And that's true. So 1972, Apollo 17, the last trip of humans to the moon. Did it really register with you that that would be the last trip?
Yep. Yes, yes, it does. Yes, it did. That's one of the places that I do my volunteer work in, next to the Apollo 17 command module, Space Center Houston, in the Apollo section. And the primary question that people ask is, why did we ever stop? And politics, uh, Vietnam War, uh, public apathy, uh, all combined to just finish the program off. Probably the accident that happened in Apollo 13 had an effect on that too. Because, of course, the decision to cancel was made before Apollo 17.
Hmm. What do you think would have been the effect if we kept the Apollo program?
One more time, I'm sorry.
Oh, what do you think would have happened if we kept with the Apollo program?
Well, I think that we would be well along in having had establishing or beginning to establish a base on Mars. I think that's the prime thing. I think that um, there would be more corporate uh, stations, commercial stations, perhaps, that there would certainly be uh, more scientific education in the schools as knowledge became available from space. Um, I, I don't know if it would have unified the world. Maybe it would have resolved a lot of differences because anything is going to have to be an international effort. So the I, the best the best example possibly is the Apple TV series uh, that deals with going on beyond on the moon. Perhaps that's the way it would have been.
I think you're talking about the series For All Mankind.
Yes, I am. That's it. Thank you. Yes.
You know, it's so well done that if somebody didn't know the history, they would be very confused.
Yes. They certainly would, particularly in the first sequence with the first season with the landing, the Russians landing, using the names Alexei Leonov. Yes, indeed, he would have been perhaps the first cosmonaut to land on the moon. Yeah, it's really well done.
And they landed the first woman on the moon.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
So you must have been knowing about Artemis from the very beginning. Um, how how's how how long ago did you learn about Artemis and our attempts to go back to the moon?
Artemis, first knowledge of it. Well, I've been following via public sources and Aviation Week magazine Constellation first, and as a matter of fact, when Constellation tested the Orion capsule for the first time using a glorified version of an SRB from the shuttle program, this would have been 7, 8 years ago, maybe a little longer ago than that. I was down for the launch, and it was one of the first launches that I had seen. Um, it went, it was a test of the escape system, I think, more than anything else. But it was the booster that they would have used, the glorified SRB that was at least almost as tall as Artemis. Wasn't the standard SRB by any means. And there was quite a crowd in the viewing area, and it was an impressive launch, but nothing nothing followed with Constellation. So Constellation then spun into Artemis, right from the Orion cap spacecraft on down to the basic shape of the boosters. Um, can I grab a model here, Nathan?
Sure thing.
This
Oh
is
wow.
this is the, don't know if you can really see it, but this is what was called the Ares 5 at the time, and it is what Constellation version of the SLS would have been. Looks familiar, doesn't it?
It does. Very, very similar to SLS.
A few more engines, but this is what was thought to be the the driving force for getting um, the start of a moon base under Constellation to the moon. And let me show you one more now that we've got these things out. Hold on. This is
That's the Ares 1.
this is the Constellation version of the launch that I told you about. So you can see that basically, now let me correct that by the launch that I saw didn't have this upper section. It had the Orion and the escape rocket attached basically to the top of the SRB stages. And the SRB stages were a little bit more than the SRB for the shuttle, a little bit taller than that. So that was the concept. That would have carried the astronauts up to the landing vehicle, I think that the Ares 5 would have put in orbit or put on the moon. So a different concept, and a concept that never panned out.
So what did surprise you that most of the people I talk to don't know that we're going back to the moon?
Well, that would surprise me now. It in November of 2023. I think that there's been enough media attention to the story, and I think that after the first two attempts, they had quite a publicity play. At least they did down here, and at Space Center Houston, in the visitors that come through and ask questions. No, I would say that most of them are aware of Artemis and are aware that we are going back to the moon. They ask when, but they're aware that there's something underway. So maybe that's just local coverage more than national. I don't know.
So what do you think about us going back to the moon?
I'm 100% in favor of it. I think that we have to. I think that right now, whether we want to admit it or not, we're in another version of the Cold War, just like we were with the Russians back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Only this time it's with the Chinese. And I don't know what the intent of the Chinese program is, but then at this point, I don't think anyone really knows. They have the independent space station. They've mentioned the moon in their plans. They have the vehicle that landed on the backside, a couple of years ago now. I think it's something that we need to spend the capital that's available for space on. I think that the last administrator of NASA, Mr. Brendenstein,
Bridenstine.
Bridenstine, did a great job in putting together a coalition of both parties to put together the financing and get things underway. So, yeah, I think it's going to happen. I think there's support at this point in time in Congress. Who knows what will happen next week? But I think that it's necessary. I think we need to keep pushing out.
Excuse me. So like the development of Starship and SpaceX and these private players, how do you see that fitting in with everything?
Well, someone mentioned last week that most of the income for space that SpaceX has been getting is NASA contracts and military contracts, and that on their own, would they be as far? I don't know. He certainly has enough money to do whatever he wants to spend on. But I think without some government oversight, some government aid, they wouldn't be quite as far as they are. Reusability, that's great. It's what's necessary to lower costs. I think that the clear role that I think NASA is trying to develop is we'll do the exploration and you guys can have low Earth orbit to do whatever you want. Put up factories, put up hotels, whatever. But we'll handle exploration. And maybe that's the way it should be.
Where do you see all this going? If you were to project out like 200 years from now, what do you think it looks like?
Hopefully the next generations will all be here 200 years from now. Optimistically, I think that we'll see Mars colonized. I think that we'll see use of asteroids, exploitation of asteroids and any other material that is in our solar system. it might be interesting to speculate that maybe, just maybe, there'll be contact with some other civilization out there in 200 years. Um, I don't know. I'm optimistic about that.
Do you think we're on Mars? Have people actually living there?
In 200 years? Oh yeah.
Uh-huh.
Oh yeah, I think so. And I think probably within 100 years, maybe even less than that, maybe 75 years.
Do you think we've gotten further, like the moons of Jupiter or the moon of Saturn?
In 75 years, sure. I think so. I think at least exploring. Yeah, I think so.
If you could, would you take a trip to space?
Sure would. In a heartbeat.
How far would you go?
Oh, I don't know. Earth orbit would be great. Um, these pop shots out of West Texas with Blue Origin. I don't know. That would be kind of fun, kind of intriguing. Matter of fact, they had their marketing version of New Shepard at Space Center Houston last week,
Oh, really?
and and volunteers and staff were lucky enough to be invited to go ahead and go on board and watch their little marketing presentation that they do. And it with the window, the big window, and there are no controls. You have no idea. Well, let me rephrase that. Of course, you've got radio contact, so you know where you are. You know how high you are. I don't know whether they have any kind of presentation going on the screens overhead, but they did in our version. They simulated a launch and a flight, and it would be fun. It would really be fun.
Wow. Was that open to the public or like what was the?
It was open to the volunteers and staff on a Saturday morning when they set it up. And then they had the debut, I think, of a film that Amazon is going to be premiering Thanksgiving week on Amazon Prime called Good Night Opie. And what that is about is the opportunity Mars rover and the fact that what was planned for a 90-day mission turned into a 15-year mission. And I don't work for Amazon, and I don't want to plug it, but I've got to say that it is one of the best space documentaries that I've ever seen. Really, really well done.
I'm looking forward to see it. I wanted to watch the preview of it at, I guess, Edward Cinema. They had it.
Yeah, they
Um,
they had it. Yeah, here in Houston. Yes. Yeah. Well, it's going to be on TV on the 23rd, I think, something like that.
I had to check it out. So kind of put yourself in the place of a high schooler living on Mars 200 years from now, who's doing a history project on the 2020s. What do you think would be worth writing about this decade in 200 years? You could leave it open-ended since we're only a couple of years into the decade, so.
Oh, I think that one major segment would be devoted to Artemis and to a successful landing on the moon. I think that um, I don't know. Other cure for cancer, perhaps. Of course, that's been wished for a long time. Um, the COVID crisis, a little section devoted to that. Something about the political dimension of this time. But the most positive thing, I think, will be the moon and returning to the moon. And I hope, I hope that that gets as much attention as the first landings in the 60s and 70s.
Well, and that's pretty much all the questions I had. Was there something else you wanted to talk about or add to this?
No, Nathan, I think that's it. This has been fun. Some good questions from you.
Well, Peter, I really appreciate your time, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Nathan. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.